This is the end, beautiful friend. This is the end, my only friend. The end of our elaborate plans. The end of everything that stands. The end, no safety or surprise. The end, I'll never look into your eyes again. Can you picture what will be so limitless and free, desperately in need of some stranger's hand in a desperate land? Lost in a romance, wilderness of pain, and all the children are insane. All the children are insane.
Saigon. Shit. I'm still only in Saigon. Every time I think I'm gonna wake up back in the jungle.
Let's look at this. Okay, this is Vietnam. First off, Vietnam has had a long history of being occupied by people who are not Vietnamese. They border with or just south of China. So for 1,000 years, there's been a sort of a back and forth with China. During the dynastic period, which was most of China's history up until 1911, but at some point, in the 19th century, mid-late 19th century, Vietnam becomes a French colony, French Indochina, which is Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos. And it remains that way until the Japanese invade East Asia, mainland China. They invade Manchuria in 31 or 32, mainland China 37. They had already controlled Korea since 1910. They invade Hong Kong, Burma, the Philippines. They invade French Indochina, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, push the French out. When World War II ends, obviously the Japanese cede all that territory and leave. Right? Or they've been pushed out already. At which point you have the post-World War II world, a sort of post-colonial push for creating independent nations. People within these colonized territories wanting independent nations, and also the sort of push from the UN, from sort of the global consensus on this in many levels. The French are going to be one of the more stubborn countries as far as ceding territory they had claimed as colonial territory prior to the German invasion of France in 1940. Right, the French Algeria. There's going to be a long, drawn-out war there. In Vietnam, they're going to fight against an independence movement of sort. It's an independence movement, basically. Ho Chi Minh, the leader of the North Vietnamese government, the communist government in North Vietnam, had not always been a communist. He had gone to Versailles in 1919, at the end of World War I, to try to gain recognition for an independent Vietnam from Woodrow Wilson, who promised self-determination of nations. He was rebuffed. He was not given an audience with Woodrow Wilson. And the self-determination component of the 14 points really didn't apply to non-European countries. A year later, he's a member of the French Communist Party. And once again, at the end of World War II, there's going to be a push for Vietnamese independence. In India, Pakistan, right, they're going to achieve independence from England, from the British. The Philippines, on July 4th, 1946, we are going to give the Philippines their independence. That's why it's on July 4th. But the French are going to try to go back into French Indochina, these three East Asian countries, and reclaim territory. They are going to meet a stiff resistance from the Ho Chi Minh, his generals, the National, no, that's not the National Liberation Front, that's later, but this, independence army. They were called National Liberation something before they were called the National Liberation Front, but that's not important. Because for about 9 years, they are holding out against the French until they defeat the French at a battle called Diem Bien Phu. Diem Bien Phu, right? The French are defeated in 1954, at which point it is clear that, it's to the United States that the government, the army that defeated the French, that have the military power and the popular, their popular power, popularity among the people, that they're going to become the ruling regime in Vietnam. They happen to be led by Ho Chi Minh, who has been a communist since at least 1920. With that whole, this is 1954, the domino theory, the containment, idea of containment, NSC 68, this Cold War mindset and the strategy has been developed already. We're almost a decade into this Cold War. So the Americans quickly move in and support a partition of the country through Geneva. Geneva partitions the country into two, North and South. But the country, North Vietnam, South Vietnam, will be reunified as one country 2 years after that, when there are elections in 1956. There will be elections to unify the country. Everyone gets to vote on which government they want. And in 1956, with the support of the United States, the South Vietnamese government that was created backs out of the elections, knowing they would lose, knowing they were not as popular and they were not as legitimate. The president of, I'm not sure if Diem was the president of Vietnam in 1954, 55, 56, but I know he was president during pretty much most of President Kennedy's administration. He's eventually going to be assassinated. But he was actually, this is the president of South Vietnam. Right? He was actually living in New Jersey when the opportunity came to be the president of the South Vietnamese government, right? As opposed to the North Vietnamese, Ho Chi Minh, who had been in Vietnam fighting, he had been a member of the French Communist Party, he got Versailles, but that was in 1919. He had been fighting the French occupation and before the Japanese occupation. They had popular support, which popular does not mean majority necessarily. It just means that you do have some support among the people, a block of support or whatever. So the refusal to the support of South Vietnam in pulling out of these elections that were to be held in 1956 leads to basically a situation where, okay, these countries are permanently partitioned. And we, the United States government, takes it upon ourselves to support the South Vietnamese through airstrikes on North Vietnam, and with military advisors that will reach at, before we start sending troops, 17,000 advisors, I believe, in 1963, 64. And eventually we will have a draft and send hundreds of thousands of young men from America to go fight in this little Southeast Asian country called Vietnam, which most folks had never heard of. And and it will be entirely in order to sort of prop up this government in South Vietnam, this and prevent the spread of communism, right? The containment idea. And the argument, you know, obviously, if you split Vietnam in half, okay, so if the other half falls, what's the big deal? The idea that was pushed that made this a scary proposition was the domino theory. The idea that if Vietnam fell, all of Southeast Asia would fall to the communists, right? The communists. And if you look at Vietnam, they're these sort of long string bean looking countries: Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. Vietnam sort of is in the east. To the west of it is Cambodia, and then Laos. Cambodia ends up having a pretty oppressive, they were claimed to be Marxist or communist regime, the Khmer Rouge under Pol Pot. So that happened anyways, even with America spending a decade in Vietnam fighting. So Eisenhower is president when the elections are called off, when the elections are agreed on and then called off. The same year that President Kennedy is elected, 1960, the National Liberation Front is formed. I believe that's basically the NVA, the North Vietnamese Army. And by November of '63, why November of '63? Was there an election? No. I mean, there may have been a special election in some parts of America. On November 22nd, 1963, only a few months shy, a couple months shy of 3 years into his first term as president, his presidential administration, President Kennedy is shot. He dies. And at that point, he had actually committed several thousand advisors to Vietnam. There were maybe a few hundred to 1,000. And who knows how many CIA folks who were over there, you know, under Eisenhower. And Kennedy sent about 16,000 advisors, which made a total 17,000. But that's advisors, right? That's 17,000 folks, you know, helping out the South Vietnamese military, giving them, you know, pointers or, you know, whatever, maybe intelligence operatives or something. That's all going to change, though, with Lyndon Johnson as president. Lyndon Johnson, who was responsible for cutting poverty in America in half, Medicare, Head Start, food stamps, in order to combat poverty and to help poor people. But with Vietnam War, what is going to happen, is while that's being done here in America, he is going to take poor people, predominantly poor men from America, young poor men from poor families, put them in uniform and send them thousands of miles away to fight in Vietnam. And 58,000 of them are not coming back. They're going to die. 3 to 5 million Vietnamese folks are going to die. And this really gets going with the Gulf of Tonkin incident, or the Tonkin Gulf incident, August 2nd and August 4th of 1964. According to Robert McNamara, who was the Secretary of Defense, there was confirmed a North Vietnamese boat that, it was a submarine, that launched a torpedo at an American vessel. The Americans claimed to be in international waters. The North Vietnamese said they were not. But there was actually a torpedo shot at an American boat, a yacht. Now, on August 4th, there was a report that this has happened again, right? Another torpedo had been shot, right? So, continued provocation. According to Robert McNamara, the August 4th torpedo that showed up on radar or whatever was a phantom. It wasn't real, you know. But the August 2nd one was. regardless, are they in international waters? Are they not? I mean, if you're off the coast of Vietnam, what are you guys doing off the coast of Vietnam? You're propping up a government in the south. If you're 8 miles off the coast instead of 5. I think international waters is like 12. If you're 12 miles off, so you're 12 miles off the coast, not 11. You're still halfway around the world. Preventing self-determination. So, anyways, as a result of this Tonkin Gulf incident, Johnson asks for a resolution called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution to expand the operation in Vietnam, to commit troops on the ground. Right there. This passes by a substantial margin, right? Large number of people. Majority vote yes. And so Johnson basically has just congressional approval to to accelerate operations in Vietnam, not just a handful of advisors advising the South Vietnamese government, military, intelligence, Air Force if they have it, but Americans flying planes over Vietnam and dropping bombs, dropping lots of bombs. We are going to spend a lot of time dropping a lot of bombs. Napalm, on this entire country, right? It's a jungle country, predominantly jungle. There's going to be jungle fighting. So in many instances, you have these 18, 19-year-old kids in a what do they call it when you dig a hole in the ground and you sit in it? Fox. I can't recall the military terminology, whatever. Foxhole? No. Yeah, I think it's foxhole. Whatever. They're dug in, ready for a firefight, right? And you have there's Marines, Army in some countries they're not familiar with. Lots of dense jungle, fighting a guerrilla war basically against folks who are committed to guerrilla warfare. So in many instances, airstrikes would be called in an attempt to sort of clear the jungle, and as a result, 3 to 5 million Vietnamese people die in this war. There's some severe ecological damage because of dropping bombs over and over and napalm and whatnot. So that Tonkin Gulf Resolution, August 1964. By February of 1965, you have an operation being carried out called Operation Rolling Thunder, which goes from February to October. And February of 65 to October of 68, which is a massive bombardment of North Vietnam, an attempt to bomb them and weaken them through airstrikes, basically, right? Which is debatable whether or not it even made a difference. The bombing of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the trail would be modified, it would be rebuilt. The term that the Bush administration, the last Bush administration, would use for the concept of ineffective airstrikes in the desert, in Afghanistan or places like that, would be pounding fists in the sand, right? And that you need boots on the ground. So this attempt at airstrikes, Operation Rolling Thunder, to support the South Vietnamese army, ultimately it's not successful in the sense that South Vietnam collapses with an invasion from the north. But you have these massive airstrikes, massive amounts of bombs being dropped from Vietnam, massive amounts of destruction. John McCain, who ran for president a few years ago, is going to be in a prison camp for 5 years. 2 different prison camps. I think he's moved at one point for 5 years. And he's there because he was shot down on his 23rd bombing mission over Vietnam for the Navy. So he flew 22 successful bombing missions over Vietnam, and probably, if you add it all up, dropped a lot of bombs. You also have 500,000 American soldiers in Vietnam on the ground, right? You have draftees, people who are drafted. And this is going to become a very contentious thing where people are going to burn draft cards, dodge the draft, protest the war. And it's all being caught on television, right? The Kennedy-Nixon debate, right? The influence of television, the potential that that medium with visual imagery, live action imagery, how that can affect the way people feel about something, is going to be an important part of this war, because this is the first war, and it's arguably the last war, where Americans are going to be exposed to as much raw footage of combat, of death, and it's going to really sway public opinion. And really, there hasn't been a war since where the media has had the kind of access they did in this war, because the potential television had for public opinion wasn't really known yet. So you have 500,000 soldiers committed to Vietnam by the end of 1968, or by the beginning of 1968, and which, if you know, I guess it's good they all got there, because in the beginning of 1968, January of 1968, or January or February, you have the Tet Offensive, right? Tet, Vietnamese New Year, Chinese New Year, a New Year's attack on 32 separate American bases and, you know, diplomatic structures like the embassy, U.S. Embassy in South Vietnam. 32, or it was 27 simultaneous attacks. It was either 27 or 32. It was basically attacks on multiple places all at once by the NVA and the Viet Cong. The Viet Cong is just the southern, like, sympathizer wing, guerrilla wing of North Vietnam, right? Folks who sympathize with the North, who are communists themselves or whatever, but who are civilians, but carry out, you know, sabotage and stuff like that, like the French Resistance, you know, sort of that role. None of these attacks, I think there's 27 sites that are simultaneously attacked during the Tet Offensive. None of them are occupied by the NVA or occupied by the North Vietnamese. They're all repelled. But it was, considering it was such a surprise, and it was all caught on camera and it was on television. People watched it. People watched as NVA soldiers were in the embassy, the U.S. embassy, shooting. Right, they breached the security of the embassy. That's, you know, that this is in the wake of being told victory was just around the corner in Vietnam, right? Which you could possibly sell to the American people vis-a-vis body counts. The idea of this war was body counts. And if you think about the numbers, 58,000 Americans died. 3-4 million Vietnamese folks died. So about, 2-3 million North Vietnamese people died in this war against 58,000. That's like one, for every one American, 15 enemies were killed. 15 of the enemy were killed. So with that, you can point to that number and say, hey, look, this war is going really well. It's, victory is right around the corner. And then something like the Tet Offensive happens. You have, around that same time, I don't know if it was a result of the Tet Offensive specifically, but Walter Cronkite, who was a news anchor, very influential, father-like, very fatherly sort of demeanor. This is back when people had like really solid trust for certain members of the media. Edward R. Murrow, Walter Cronkite, is going to basically take some time from his news program to do like an op-ed to break off and make a personal statement about his feelings on the war. And he's going to be very critical of the Johnson administration. It's going to be very influential in Johnson deciding not to run for president, right? When Walter Cronkite, this like father time figure for America, who gives them the news, is telling them the country that he's very disappointed in the Johnson administration, suspicious that victory is even possible or around the corner. So Johnson doesn't seek a re-election. He is challenged by the anti-war coalition in the Democratic Party, who recruit Eugene McCarthy. Gene McCarthy, right? Not Bobby Kennedy. He jumps in later. And Gene McCarthy, who runs as a protest candidate, to dump Johnson, does pretty well in the first early primaries, right? He ends up with a very visible following in the percentage of votes. So Johnson takes note of that and decides he doesn't want to run. This is the man who had declared a war on poverty, whose administration is known as the Great Society. Poverty was cut in half. I believe the number in your textbook is 24% to 13%, right? Poverty was reduced to 13%. Howard Zinn in people's history of the United States puts the number at 11%. Poverty was reduced to as low as 11%. Head Start, Medicare, food stamps, immigration reform, all of these things, you know. Inheriting the space race, this Kennedy space race, right? Inheriting, you know, all these, but the Vietnam War is what breaks his popularity, breaks his ability to get reelected in his own eyes. He, you know, he thinks it's not that possible. Or, you know, I mean, in 1964, he won. He basically kicked the shit out of Barry Goldwater. It's one of the biggest ass kickings in the history of presidential elections. You know, I mean, you look at the Reagan, Carter, and possibly even 1984. Reagan kicked a lot of ass too. And yeah, by 1968, that's wrong, right? And the Democratic Party is going to be divided over the issue over war and other things. You're going to see a massive protest at the Democratic Convention, anti-war protest, in which the police in Chicago, led by a Democrat Mayor Daley, one of these like throwbacks to a big city boss. He's going to have the police go out, kind of like McCarthy with the bonus army in World War I or in Great Depression. And what happens is going to be labeled as a police riot. Police using overtly aggressive force against students demonstrating the war. Dan Rather is going to be attacked by Mayor Daley's private security when he tries to ask Mayor Daley a question. There are going to be delegates and politicians at the convention who are going to take the microphone, take the podium, take that platform, and publicly condemn the mayor and condemn what's happening in the streets while the mayor is sitting there. You know, stuff like that is like having the Olympics come to your city. It's a big deal, and this is a situation where a very overzealous big city boss thought he could use brute force to silence dissent, and it ended up backfiring. And he looks really bad. And history is not very kind to him. That's Mayor Richard Daley, whose son was actually a part of the 2000 Gore campaign. So that's fine. It's just, you know, no guilt by association. But anyways, so you have 500,000 American soldiers committed to Vietnam, dropping a bunch of bombs on this country, a bunch of napalm, no real end in sight. And in November of 1968, Richard Nixon is back in national politics, and he will be elected president. And he ran in 1968 on a secret plan to end the war, right? He ran on the idea of the silent majority, which is just folks who don't protest, right? Folks who are in the suburbs, white people in the suburbs who are quiet, who go to work, pay their taxes, And he's going to run on a secret plan to end the war.